Hi, all. This is Aaron Tebow. I am the director of games and esports and director of the Live Lab at Texas A&M University. Very recently, I was at Gearbox Software for over 17 years as co-EP of the Borderlands games, and where I built a production group and was head of strategic operations. Um, Very fun times, and getting into more of the R&D side of what I love to do at A&M. I had the great opportunity to interview our guest who spoke in the session that we're about to watch, Michael Romey from LAIKA. Uh, the topic of the session is unlocking production efficiency with LAIKA, and it is great to have you all with us as we explore how today's most innovative studios are using engineering-driven strategies to solve creative and operational challenges. Today's speaker, he has the role of manager of business intelligent software development at LAIKA Studios, which has been part of my and I'm sure many of your favorite entertainment memories. Michael brings over 25 years of experience developing technical infrastructure and production pipelines at some of the most respected studios in entertainment, spanning themed attractions, virtual production, and global VFX ops. At Disney Imagineering, Mike helped build the back-end infrastructure for Star Wars Rise of the Resistance, part of the Galaxy's Edge expansion that drew millions of new visitors to Disneyland and Walt Disney World in its opening years. I have to say, my family and I still talk about that all the time. The systems he developed helped bridge physical environments with digital media, laying the groundwork for immersive storytelling that spans physical engineering and digital creative worlds. Earlier at Zoic Studios, Mike helped pioneer virtual production workflows for episodic television, bringing real-time environments to shows like V and Once Upon a Time. At Fuse FX, he led the development of the Nucleus platform, a scalable cloud-enabled pipeline that unified workflows across global offices, improving efficiency for large-scale productions. And today, as part of LAIKA Studios, Mike is part of a growing trend across creative industries, building highly customized cloud-based systems that empower small development teams to deliver powerful tools without ballooning overhead or technical debt. And he continues to enable creators who bridge the physical and digital worlds, given LAIKA's specialty, as we know, is excellent stop-motion storytelling. And their new film, Wildwood, is getting tremendous buzz. Empire Magazine calls it the hardest film LAIKA Studios has ever made, a decade in the making fantasy epic that's set to push the studio's capabilities to a whole new level. This kind of innovation, creating unified data platforms, intelligent internal tools, and flexible integration frameworks, is becoming increasingly common across sectors, especially, I might add, in video game development, where studios must also bridge production, QA, HR, and publishing through unified backend infrastructure. Just like in animation and VFX, studios are realizing that operational scale depends on engineering elegance. Mike's experience sits right at this intersection where code, creativity, and collaboration meet. And today, he'll take us inside the world that LAIKA is creating for all of us. Through engineering, not just great films, but great systems behind the scenes. Please join me in welcoming Michael Romey.
I really appreciate it. That's a great introduction. I'm gonna start by bringing up my slide deck with a little video, and I'll kind of walk you through some of our technology stack. So today, hopefully you're seeing my screen. I'm going to talk about this thing we call the LAIKA Federated API. And the LAIKA Federated API kind of is the connective tissue that allows us to kind of connect all the different services in our business operations and production together to kind of help run our business. So I thought maybe the best part to start is kind of about who LAIKA is. We're a stop motion animation studio. We've done a number of films. Some of you have seen some of them, as well as this new one coming out called Wildwood. We're owned by Phil Knight and Travis Knight, and we're located in Hillsboro, Oregon, in Portland area. And so what I thought I'd do is I thought I'd at least start by playing, a teaser video about the art and science of LAIKA. So that'll give you kind of a background about kind of the work that we do and the creative intent around it. So I'm going to just burn through about 2 minutes just to play this video. I think it's a really good representation of the work that we do, and it'll get you going as we kind of start talking about this federated API. So with that said, we'll press play.
When you walk down the halls of LAIKA and you enter any set of curtains, what you enter into is always going to be a complete surprise, and it's going to be completely different.
It is absolutely true that every new movie that we make gets that bit more ambitious.
We want to make films that push this medium that we love, animation, that push it in new directions.
And we're moving in directions that stop motion animation doesn't normally go in.
And so every film demands something new, but everyone's up for the challenge.
We've got a brain trust of brilliant creatives here.
We have people who are sculpting puppets, we have people who are making sets, we have people who are animating all day long.
And I think that's what's cool about this place, is it's this tactile wonderland.
To do it practically in camera is something we try to do as much as possible. But at the same time, we bring cutting-edge technology into the process.
Whether it's science or innovation, it's worth the risk sometimes to go out on a limb.
And with each successive film, we all work and grow as artists.
We really wanted to find a way to push facial animation beyond what we'd ever done before.
And the subtlety and a range of emotion.
You get totally transformed into the story and you forget that you're watching a little 12-inch puppet.
It's hands-on, it's tactile, there's a life to it that most other animation forms don't have anymore. We're a group of really talented artists who want to do it the best that we can.
Here at LAIKA, the energy, the atmosphere just really crackles with that creativity.
We don't have to be limited in the stories that we tell. That's what's exciting about the studio.
It feels like we really are just scratching the surface of what this art form can do. And that's incredibly exciting to me.
You're here, Kubo.
So hopefully that gives you guys, everyone, kind of a good idea about the work that we do. Start with just a little bit of a background. My name is Mike Romey. I usually go by Romey. There's often many mics in the room. I manage our business systems integrations at LAIKA Studio, and we're a small team of about 5 people who help kind of build this connective tissue that kind of connects, production management workflows to our various business operations. And so one of the things that I was tasked to when I joined LAIKA was to kind of, set, a kind of a direction for us around our business systems transformation. It ended up, it still is a multi-year effort really to connect all these business operations with production. That means achieving interoperability across all the units, whether it be, production, human resources, visual effects, recruiting, kind of reduce friction across all those units and operations. Each one of those operations has a different service, a source of truth that they store their data in, right? For our production teams, they use things like ShotGrid. For our recruiting team, they use things like Greenhouse. For our finance and accounting teams, they use Dynamics 365 F&O, and really reduce the friction to communicate between all these. Enable rapid development. A lot of times what happens in these production environments is that we're not able to kind of iterate quickly, but by building some infrastructure, which is what I'm going to talk about, some of that infrastructure here, it allows us to rapidly build tools, throughout the facility really, really quickly. We also needed to kind of streamline reports. these are reports, instead of having to write code that generates Excel documents, is there a way that we can kind of hydrate, a data warehouse, a data lake, and generate those reports by, using templating systems in Excel where the data is kind of pulled into Excel as needed. Dashboards, how do we make executive dashboards, graphs, charts that are either integrated with a service, i.e. maybe an iframe view that shows a table of data and charts within the host application, or better yet, something that's an executive dashboard like Power BI where we can pull from that data warehouse, that data lake into that view and let our leadership kind of see our progress. And then obviously, to facilitate, um, better data collection. I think the big challenge most of us have in pipelines is, if the data isn't good as it comes in, it's not very useful to us. So by building a custom, framework to build, forms, we can basically ensure that we're collecting data in the most efficient manner possible. So this is kind of some of our initiatives. And we broke it down into this thing called the federated form or federated framework. It's basically a cohesive framework of all these connective services. I call it our connective tissue. And it's made up of a few different things. Things that this federated API, which I'm going to talk to you about, federated scripts, and federated forms. Federated API is basically a common query language to run CRUD operations, right? Every single one of these services that we're going to talk about today, they all have their own REST APIs. Some of them are, most of our services are SaaS services. So they're not really running on-prem, but they're running from cloud providers. They have various flavors of create, read, update, and delete and schema operations, but they're all different. And so getting a developer to be able to kind of build that connective tissue to communicate between all these services becomes a complicated matter. So we built this federated API that basically normalizes the language across all of them. Think of it as like batch, creates or batch updates or batch deletes, but you can do it across multiple services and environments. So that's what the federated API is. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. We have federated scripts. These are things that are basically how we run this framework. It's all run at Azure as a function. It's ephemeral compute. Basically in Azure, we're running a Python script that does one of three things. It's either an event or like a webhook worker whose job is like, hey, when you change the value of A, we should update the value of B. And anytime that service throws an event inside of this, inside of their service, it goes to the webhook and it computes that. And so that's a federated script for us. We have action menus. You're maybe inside a ShotGrid and you say, I want to build a report based off of this data. And so it's an action menu. And then we have forms. And I'm going to talk about those. So these are kind of our three buckets in terms of what our federated framework does. And I thought the most valuable part of this conversation is talking about our federated API, because this is kind of the glue that kind of ties everything together. So without getting into too many of the services, we have about 23, 25 services now that are all tied together through this federated API. Some of them you may be familiar with here. This is an older list, but the big ones are things like ShotGrid for production, or Dynamics 365 for finance and operations, or UKG for human resources. But you'll probably be familiar with a lot of these here, and we have a lot more. But the idea here is that developers shouldn't have to learn, how to interface with these databases, because every single one has a different REST API with different endpoints. So what we've done is we've normalized them to all be, accessible from a common, language. So for those who don't know what CRUD stands for, create, read, update, and delete. But we've also added schema queries, right? A lot of these services have, a schema, and let's say, I think it's that defines the tables, the fields. And so a lot of times developers need to know, well, what is a service? Where's the environment? Which tables of data do I have access to? Which fields are in them, and what data types in there? And so what we've done is we've also used Open API to kind of build, a means to communicate with all of these services because we have the definitions of all the tables and all the columns of data in all the services. So the thing I thought would be good was to kind of walk you through a little bit around how we interface with these services by jumping into Postman. Postman's kind of where we start to kind of assemble commands in this federated API. And I'm going to start with some simple ones. So in the beginning, I'm going to start with this one called schema service read. And again, this is a pre-canned video, so I'm going to talk through it. But I'm going to turn that on inside of Postman, and it's just going to run that request. And you'll see here on the right that basically what we've done is we've queried all the services that our permission key has access to. And you can kind of see here on the right, sorry, I'm jumping ahead. Let me just play again. You'll see here on the right in a second, you'll see all the services, and the service key that I have has permissions to read, create, and update and delete in each one of these services. However, if a developer is building this, for production, you're using this tool for production, they may see a subset of these services. So this helps, make sure that whoever has access to the federated API can only have access to certain parts of these services. The next command is environments. So some of our services have multiple environments. In this case, I'm looking at our payroll service. We only have one environment there for production. But in the case of things like ShotGrid, we might have 2 or 3 different environments for staging, for production, sometimes even for vendors when we interface with vendors. So this is a way for us to document, this service and also the different environments that we have for that service. So it's convenient. I spoke about schema. So in this example, I'm basically doing a schema entity read, which basically is a way to read all the tables. And I'm saying, hey, go look at all the tables in a service called UKG. And I have to press send over here on the right. But go and filter to the person table, the employee table, or the compensation table. And so you can kind of see here that it shows us all the different tables that are in that service. This is really important, and I think we take for granted some of this. When you start diving into integrations that dive into like finance and accounting, especially Dynamics, that service has 3,000 tables. Many of them are dormant, about 1,500 of them are dormant, but understanding how to list all the tables, get access to the tables, and do it in a unified manner is really powerful. And so that's why we also appended this schema entity read. So going a little bit further, we might be able to dive into a particular table. In this case, I want to look at a table called employee and want to see the fields on that table called employee. And when we press send, it'll look for that and say, okay, well, there's various fields in here, whether it be the employee name, the employee status, maybe their hire date, things of that nature. And so having these schema fields helps us kind of understand how to interface with the service so that we can build, maybe find, creates, or updates. So you'll notice here when you're looking at some of the kind of configuration around our post commands here, they kind of look like a ShotGrid REST API. They have things, they're batch modes. We're doing a request type of find. We're saying the table we want to look at, the filters we want to apply, and the fields we want to apply, and the number of data entries we want to turn back. So this becomes really easy if you're a developer, who's interfaced with ShotGrid. Great. Now you can interface with our payroll system. Now you can interface with our finance and accounting system. Now you can interface with our recruiting system. And in this case, I'm doing a query to the employee table. I'm asking for it to return, the ID field, the org level 1, 2, and 3 field, and the hire date. And I'm asking for 3 entries back. So this is really powerful because it means that we can get developers to join our team, to interface with the system really quickly, and be able to kind of talk to any service in the mix. And then lastly, we can jump to another service. So in this case, I have a ShotGrid command here that's saying, hey, find me, a list of departments, find only 15 of them, give me their ID and name. And if we press send, this acts more like a pass-through because it's very much like ShotGrid in terms of its API, and we'll get the response. But the cool part about all of this is that I'm showing you each one of these types of request types, but we can tie them all together. So in a second here, we can unlock maybe the find command for the employees inside of UKG and append it to the department, inside of ShotGrid and run them concurrently. And what happens here is that for each one of these functions, it gets fanned out to a different Azure function, and the data then comes back together. So we can basically run it in parallel as opposed to serially. And the cool part about what we're doing here is that not only can we do this across all the service, but without getting into too many details, we can also do deep field responses like ShotGrid does, like, hey, I want to look at a human user and find the department and the manager from that department in the same query. We can do that across these services as well as bounce across services. So for example, you could look at tasks inside of ShotGrid and go and look at the compensation about a user on that task and figure out what the cost of a task is through one command with extended field responses. I'm not going to show that here, but this gives you an idea what our federated API does, and this allows us to do some really powerful things. And that's where kind of we get into our data warehousing and dashboards. So we mentioned all these services. The goal is to kind of get data out of all these services, right? And bring them into this basically Azure, data warehouse space. And so we use that federated API running on a cron service as an Azure function that basically takes data and finds data from these services and writes them out as what's called a Parquet file. And this is kind of really interesting and a great way to kind of interface with data warehousing and reporting. A Parquet file is like a very advanced version of a CSV file. It's not just, rows and columns. It's column definitions that say this column is a date field, or this column is, a dollar field, or this column is a number field. So we pull data every night from these services. We pick and pluck the tables that are of interest from these tables, and we save them out as Parquet files. Those Parquet files then become part of our Azure Synapse space, and they act as like a virtual database where basically we don't have to worry about running upserts to the database. We can just rewrite, a Parquet file. And as a result, these downstream services that basically build dashboards or build solver reports, which are really just, Word template or Excel templates that are pointers to data in our data warehouse, we can build these pretty quickly. And so what we've done is we've built a series of dashboards that interface with every single different business operations. I'm only showing one without getting too carried away. But we built, ones for each different business operation, whether you're looking at production, whether you're looking at, finance, whether you're looking at, accounting, things of that nature. You're just looking here at a recruiting one. But the idea here is that because we've hydrated our warehouse with Parquet files that go into Solver, we're able to kind of hang dynamics off of this framework to build reports pretty easily. So instead of having to, use some report library to generate some SVG report and have some page window to view it, we can kind of just use the data warehouse and, an application like Power BI to draw it, which makes it really, really powerful and convenient. So moving along, I wanted to also talk about our federated form framework. So federated forms, we know that data needs to go into these services, but what we've learned, I've learned over the years is that a lot of these services, some of them have structured form input data that has fields that are required to submit, or regex that ensure that you name or put some value in a field a certain way. But most of these services don't have anything like that. So once you get outside of production and outside of ShotGrid, you're going to find that a lot of these services are open door forms that don't really have field and form validations. So what we wanted to do was also take what we learned about this federated API and build kind of a form framework to kind of make form validation possible. I've done it before. I did it at Imagineering. I did it at Fuse. It ends up kind of looking something like this. And it basically means that we're running this Azure function, in a federated script to run some Python. The Python calls our federated API to get data from whatever service we're interested in, whether it be our payroll service, UKG, whether it's Dynamics, our finance system, or ShotGrid for production, kind of collects it together and builds, widgets, whether they be, a text field, a pick list, a table, a Gantt chart, a pie chart, whatever it may be. And what we do is we translate, the data into JSON. So we're basically describing a form through JSON. And in doing so, we have a library called the Federated Form Framework, which basically translates that JSON file into a React form. So what that really means when you break it down, we have 5 developers. We have 1 dedicated developer on that team who's a full stack developer. It means that everyone on the team basically has these superpowers to build, full stack web applications, but they actually don't have to be full stack developers. And this is where it's really, really powerful. And this is how we're able to develop things pretty quickly. There's a number of libraries that do this kind of operation where they're using Python to describe React. I think there's one called Reflex that's out there. And there's another one called RJSF. But we've kind of decided to roll our own. The reason why we've rolled our own is because we're starting to use some more complicated components. So it's not just about using material UI and having, standard checkboxes or pick lists. It's about using some advanced components that we pay for, like AG Grid, which is kind of a performant grid component. And then we also use a number of libraries, components from Brintum that allow us to do, Gantt charts and scheduling interfaces and calendars. So I thought I'd also show you kind of under the hood and show you a few forms that we've created. I'm going to show you forms that don't dive into, business operations outside of my domain that I feel comfortable sharing here. So this is the first form that I'm going to share with you. This form is a form that I use to communicate to my stakeholders. It basically is a create release note form. It's basically a form that I use myself, but I also give to other, technology business managers to build release notes from our issue tracking system. So you have at the top a list of projects. So you can assume that I'm doing a federated API to find a list of projects that I might have access to. It goes and uses a schema query to say, what are the issue types in that service, bugs, features, and tasks? What's today's date? What's the release date? What do I want to put in the summary? What other peripheral fields do I want to show when I generate this report? How do I want to drive Epic logic? And then it generates this release notes HTML document that you're seeing on the right-hand side. And this report has a send email operation. This is basically a way for me to kind of show people what we've been working on the last week, last month, the last quarter. It interfaces a little bit with ShotGrid, UKG to find, or Entra to find a list of employees when you send out an email. It uses UTrack, which is our issue tracking system. And again, it takes all of the things I showed you before, kind of taking, our federated API to get data, our federated form framework to draw a form, to basically build, an interface that has, collects structured data for form input. Pretty simple and pretty helpful. I'm going to show you one more, and then maybe we can kind of have some open discussion about some of the strategies we've taken here. So the last thing I'm going to show is this is a form just like that other form. It's not really a form for data input, but what it is it's a form to show a grid of data with a chart. And so we're using this library called AG Grid. And what's happening here is that we're using the federated API. We've given it a date range to say, hey, find all the information between the current quarter and show me all the tasks, all the features, and all the bugs, and summarize their data. And so in this case, we're using UTrack, where our issues live. We have a summary command that's being run to summarize things by task, by features, or bugs. And then we're also putting it in a chart. And so what you're seeing here actually acts a lot like a template. This template is being used for me to build this developer insight grid view for me to track, issue counts and story points for my team. But the same template that I have here for a form is also being used to kind of evaluate timesheets and time logged against, a particular project, or to figure out who's submitted timesheets, or to figure out, the status of tasks or shots that could be done. So this template is quite flexible, but the goal here is really to be able to kind of build anything. And really what I've shown you is a lot of the different pieces that we're using to kind of glue all this together. And again, the goal here more than anything is to basically to kind of communicate across all of our different business operations really, really conveniently and easily, and really understand what each department manager needs, and to be able to kind of understand how to provide them that information. And this framework allows us to do that pretty quickly. So I thought maybe instead of chatting too much, I thought I'd open it up for some questions maybe.
All right, great. So let's take a look and see what we have going on in the Q&A chat. So I see a few. I don't know, Michael, if you're able to see it directly, but I'll go ahead and ask the questions that we see in here
Sure.
to help out. So the first one I see is a question from Christine Middlemiss. Where is the source of truth? Is it UKG? Is the connection live on the Federated API? Where's the truthiness happening here?
That's a good question. I in the beginning of my career, I often thought that there had to be one big monolithic single source of truth. People throw the word single source of truth around, and it's really problematic because source of truth is really only truthful to the person and their context. And so what happens when people think of everything as a single source of truth, they start doing things that they shouldn't do. I'll give you an example. They go into something like ShotGrid, they turn on, some custom entity, and they basically make a compensation table and put dollars in there to tie, dollars and rates to an employee so that they can, solve some problem. And what happens is you start polluting sources of truth with data that doesn't belong, in that source of truth. So I would say that you have to think about it more in terms of business operations. Each of our business operations has a source of truth. A good example is ShotGrid is our source of truth for production, but it's not our source of truth around employee and hiring or compensation. And it's certainly not the source of truth for our financials or actuals. So I would say we have multiple sources of truths. What we have is glue that allows us to provide connective tissue between those sources of truths. And then what we do is we build window panes of glass so that users can see a source of truth from another source of truth. So in the last example, I showed this developer insight grid view, and it was showing you how my team of developers, and are working through issues. Well, that can be drawn as an iframe view so that if, a common usage pattern is for managers to look at their teams from ShotGrid, I can make an iframe view that only presents that into that single source of truth, but doesn't import the data. So our goal is to kind of be cognizant to not pollute those sources of truths and co-populate them with data that doesn't belong there. That does mean, though, that we have to have addresses and lineage that tie them together. Things like department numbers versus department names that tie them together between these services, employee numbers that are unique across all these services. So there's common threads, needles that can be threaded between these services, like an employee's number or a department number or a division number or a sub-department number. But what we do try not to do is pollute the system with data that's not needed from a peripheral source of truth.
Makes sense. So religious debate, what's true and what's not true. Next question we have is the metrics dashboard you're using Prometheus, Grafana based, or is it a custom solution?
We use two things for dashboards. We use Power BI and we use AG Grid with their charting interface when we want to build custom stuff. So we're not using Prometheus or Grafana for our reports. And what we call reports might be different than what you think of reports. Our reports are very finance centric. We're using this library, this application. It's more like a plugin for Excel. And what it does is it basically treats Excel like a templating system. So inside of Solver, and you can look it up, it's called Solver Global. It allows you to hydrate their data warehouse with data, and we do that with our Parquet files. And then what happens inside of Excel, you have the ability to go into a design mode and say, I want this column to show this data, I want this column to show that data from this service, and so forth and so forth. And then when you press run, it takes that template and it cascades all the data into the Excel sheet. So the data doesn't really live in Excel. The Excel ends up being a templating system, and you have all the things that you would have, available to you, like inside of ShotGrid, which is, which columns do I want to show, which, how do I want to group, how do I want to sort, how do I want to order it, but you're really never putting the data inside of that templating system. And then that templating system allows us to basically generate reports that get sent out to our business unit and our stakeholders using those templates on a nightly basis. So I can say, here's a solver report I built for headcount for a particular project. Very simple. It's like, hey, filter to this project, filter, group by this, these departments, by these positions. And that template then can be run every night. So as those Parquet files are writing to our data warehouse for Solver, that report that's basically kind of running on its own cron system runs, and it sends out a report to the user. The user gets an email. They say, hey, here's your report for your headcount for the week or the month or the quarter. And it's a link. And it links them to Solver, and they have kind of this web viewer that allows them to kind of view this. Anything you can make in Excel, you can view in a web interface without having to worry about Excel files that are getting shared around. So you're using Excel, and all your finance and operations people can build templates as they know how to, but they're doing it based off of our data warehouse. And then we're not sharing via email Excel documents that go out of date. We're just maintaining templates that describe how to pull data out of our data warehouse.
There's a question that's further down. I'm going to kind of leap ahead and then come back because it's so aligned with the answer that you gave just previously. And by the way, I'll mention, so with way that using Excel as a templating system, I guess for people who are coming to LAIKA from somewhere else, we're very comfortable building formulas in Excel, and that scripting method must be very comfortable for them.
Yep, it's very comfortable
to
when
contribute.
You have full Excel scripting, expression language. The difference is that you're telling it a marker and which cell to do the expression on, as opposed to what the number is there.
Right. No, that's pretty elegant, I think. So there was a question about, so we were talking about sources of truth a little while ago, and how do you communicate? I guess, how is it exposed, or do you have like an easy to see kind of chart of how data is flowing? The question from Jason is, how do you communicate what service is the source of truth for which data, and how is that decision made?
Gosh.
And by the way, I'll just say, from, not without giving anything away from Gearbox, I'll just say that we had some hot debates about that, and which department should own it and which system should it be. What's, especially you mentioned compensation data. So how do people know kind of who owns or which system owns the data for which thing?
Obviously the manager and the department manager of that SaaS services knows their domain. What we've learned over time is that, people tend to think that the data that they have and they're managing, they're owning in an Excel file. I'll give you an example in the position list. But the truth of the matter is, our comp and benefits team defines, our positions, right? Then they share that with our payroll service team, in terms of documented job descriptions and their salary grades. So what I think we've learned is that the stakeholders of these departments know that they own these services. I think it ends up really, working with the people who peripherally need that information to understand that they might have a view of that data, but or they might, use context of that single source of truth to build, I'll give you an example. It's a really good example. We do resource planning, and we do resource planning using the booking table inside of ShotGrid. So the booking table is a booking that says, hey, I need somebody to work in production. They're going to be, working in production for, a year, 2 years, or 3 years. And they're going to do so under the, context of a position. I'll use maybe they're you know, a stage animator. Okay. And so what we do is we educate, the stakeholders, that are involved in maybe building, a resource planning report about positions to say, okay, well, we need to have, the comp and benefits team needs to own, defining those positions because that's where they're going to iterate around, the compensation and the job description. But once they've, locked down that position, there's a position code, and that code can be used, in all these other services to, you know, indirectly tie them to things like what's the compensation or what's the department. And so remember in the beginning, I was talking about, I have all these different, sources of truth, but there has to be something that connects the dots between the two. Maybe a department number, not a name, or maybe, employee number, not a name, because names changes or department names changes. Well, in this case, our positions change, right? And so what we do is we kind of build, a workflow diagram with all the stakeholders involved, saying, okay, we're going to solve resource planning for production accounting. Let's, get into, a room to talk about, all the different ingredients that are going to help bake the cake to be able to present, a unified resource plan across multiple projects and departments. Let's define, where those sources of truths are. And so for each project that we build, we'll meet with the stakeholders and lock down those sources of truths and kind of untangle that knot. I kind of think of it when my daughters were younger, they used to have like all these gold chains, right? And I'd go into their jewelry box and you'd find just knots and knots of gold chains. And right before they're left to go to school, I need to get to school, I need to get to school. But right before, can you unknot this chain? And you sit there with the tweezers and untweezing it, right? I think our job, from business operations and being the connective tissue is to kind of help those different, business operations untangle the knot in terms of this problem might be, doing a resource plan for forecasting for a future project and helping them all understand how they play an integral role with it without forcing them all to be in one single source of truth.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I like your analogy of untweezing the the golden knot.
Yeah.
How do you handle orchestration of events to prevent cycles between the various systems from Claude Martins?
Great question. So first off, all of our services are not on-prem. They're not on a server. They're running as Azure functions. Azure functions are basically pay-as-you-go compute. So what that basically means that is if I have some script whose job is to hydrate data inside of a service or generate a Parquet file, or maybe it has to generate 10 Parquet files, we fan out each one of those operations in the Federated API through those batch operations. So it goes out to a function, and we have a cap on the number of functions that can run concurrently inside of Azure. But we're basically using some of the Azure event orchestration systems to manage, how many, functions we can run concurrently. I think that, if you're an AWS person, we're talking about Lambdas and SQS. We're using Event Bridge and functions and blobs inside of Azure. There's different like terminology, but they're all the same thing. We're using a bunch of the orchestration tools that are made available inside of Azure to drive that in terms of capping the number of functions that can run concurrently, building our code in a meaningful manner that they can run concurrently, making sure that those services can get the data that they need. I'll give you an example where we have to kind of go through some kind of tools to do orchestration, especially when there's big data sets. So for example, we have a general ledger. When you're dealing with finance and accounting, there's usually a ledger sheet that contains every plus or minus dollar for the company, right? So it's millions and millions of transactions, right? And we use Dynamics 365 F&O, and they use this, API called OData, and it's awful. It's really awful. It's really outdated, and it's really hard to get, to do server-side summarizations. It's really hard to aggregate a bunch of data. So like historically, we've been only be able to get like, a few thousand entries at a time. So now we have some orchestration that can go do the pagination of getting that data and getting hundreds of thousands or millions of entries, all at one time. Better yet, we have some means to do, data warehousing. And so what we've learned is like in services like big transactional services like Dynamics and things like a GL or ShotGrid and things like a task table. We found that sometimes it's more complicated or it puts a strain getting that information out of those services, especially if you have to build big reports. So using some of the Azure services, we're able to synchronize some of those services and their tables of data into something that they have called Fabric. And so we can synchronize that data into Fabric. And there we can do these server-side summaries and aggregations against millions of tasks, whether it be a general ledger or whether it be, a ShotGrid task table. And sometimes we have to cache that data into these bigger tables where we can do better aggregates so that if the interface that we're building is a form and it needs to show a lot of that data for it to be performant, not just a static report that gets generated at the night and gets sent to somebody in the morning, but let's say an interactive report around maybe the general ledger or an interaction report around tasks, we can use that service that's synchronized every night inside of Azure's Fabric environment to make that data available to us. And so that's some of the ways that we deal with big data sets, getting data across all those services. Hopefully that helps.
Absolutely. And we have a couple of questions that kind of relate. So I'm gonna read more than one, and you kind of pick from that how you want to go about answering. But first, so in that line of things, comment and question. So really impressive stuff. How long did it take you to get to this point? How many devs did you have working on this? And to go along with that, there's a question that just popped up about if you could talk about the process of onboarding and educating the department stakeholders that will use and build the dashboards. There's probably some overlap, I would guess, in those questions. Yeah.
Sure. So I'll talk about the time to develop. The Federated API, it's just an ongoing development thing. We're constantly adding new services, but I'd say the core of that infrastructure took about a year to build. And the year to build was kind of identifying the core services that we wanted to be available in it. And I think we ended up out the gates, in about a year having 15 or 20 of those services in there. Because what we did was we wrote a template. What you'll learn about a lot of these services is that they don't all behave the same and they're not as all robust as the other. And so a lot of times we were forced to get all the data and then filter through it in post, which is unfortunate. Not all services, had the robustness that we wanted around a filter language. Our filtering language inside of the Federated API looks like ShotGrid. It's like, find me all statuses that are in this list of statuses, or find me a date range between these date ranges. So we wrote a template, and that basically meant that all we had to do is kind of, in some of these services that aren't very well documented in their REST APIs, we just had to find ways to kind of, collect the data in a kind of a guerrilla manner, and then be able to kind of wrap them around this post operations to do, field responses or filtering the data in post. And then what we did over time is we improved it. We said, oh, I think in this service, we can do something more native, filtering against these fields or these tables. Because not all services allow you to filter every single field in their systems the same way. So in about a year and some change, we got a lot of those hooked up. And then over time, we've been just building them. I mean, recently we built one for Shopify. We built, we're building one for GitHub right now. And we'll build one for Jira soon. So it ends up being pretty easy once we got all those in place to just kind of build some new service. And so that effort was really, two developers, one lead developer and myself as kind of, overseeing and kind of pseudo developing just the Federated API. And now that developer kind of maintains the Federated API, they extend it to other services, and they add, and they also deal with kind of the DevOps and deployment of that service, and our federated form framework and functions. Then we got to the point where like, okay, this is good. We have data moving across these services. So we took a beat and started focusing on how do we do reporting. And so that's where we kind of found Parquet files and how you interface with Parquet files to hydrate things like Solver, to hydrate things like Power BI. The same could be used for Tableau. We stumbled across libraries like PyArrow that make building Parquet files really easy. And we basically spent, a good, 4 to 6 months just building prototypes for each one of those business operations to say, here's the art of what's possible. If you let us, into your business operations, we can hydrate our warehouse, and therefore we can build Power BI dashboards that are unique to your business operations, but that can fold up to an executive dashboard. And so that's what we did. And you saw one of those dashboards that were part of that prototyping session around dashboards. So that was really just one or two developers. We have a developer on our team who literally specialized, and I wouldn't call her a developer as much as an administrator. She's kind of a subject matter expert around power dynamics. So when you start getting into finance and operations and you start dealing with these ERP systems, they're kind of a behemoth of themselves. And when you get into big enterprises, they're using these things called ERPs, and they're really complicated. And so we have a dedicated person on our team, because most of our work was really from coming at the data from a financial centric solution problem, right? How do we quantify the cost to do business, the way we do business? And so having ERP integration, required us to have somebody who knows, the Dynamics 365 F&O environment. For a period of time, we also had, a loaned out person for our current infrastructure who was a subject matter expert around some of these Azure services. Like, how do I set up Entra? How do I set up Azure functions? How do I set up blobs? Our team hadn't really dealt with some of the Azure services. Most of us had dealt with AWS services like Lambdas and S3 buckets. So wrapping our head around Azure, required us to have somebody who kind of specialized and understood that, a bit better. After that first, year and a half, then we started diving into, okay, well, the data coming into these services isn't looking great. We need to build, a form framework. How do we want to do this? Should it all be native, React code? Should it be, could it be something, a blend? And really what we concluded was there's so much things that people wanted, the potential that they saw out of the platform, that we needed a way to kind of build things a lot quicker. With some experience having done this operation of abstracting, full stack, web applications into React via JSON, takes a little time. So you start kind of looking at, and we had one developer who would focus on that. So he says, okay, here's material UI, here's our key components. Let's do an abstraction for those. And then it gets into kind of the real meat and potatoes, like, hey, we need this grid view that acts a lot like a shot grid view that has filtering and grouping and summarization. So then we're like, well, let's not build it ourselves, let's buy it. So we basically purchased and licensed those services that allow us to build grids and charts and schedules and calendars, and then wrote that abstraction layer on that. And I'd say that also kind of happened concurrently. And so in the beginning, we identified some of those simple tools that we could build for success. I'll give you an example. We wrote one that's, how do I initialize a contractor? It's like a contractor form that says, here's my first name, my last name, here's, here's the address, here's my business of operations, things like that. And it collected all that data to shove it into Dynamics, and a cron job who syncs that contractor as a human user to ShotGrid. So that was one of our first ones. We found these simple forms that didn't require too much sophistication. And then we just start building more and more. And so once you build each one of those components that make up that recipe, it ends up becoming really, really quick, to the point where, I give you an example. This weekend, I decided to put together a prototype to see how quickly can we put together a time card system that basically can pull from all these services to find breadcrumb trails that people, spent some activity in that system doing something to initialize a time card system. And we put together a really great prototype in literally like 8 hours. Because we already had an abstraction to a calendar view. Like, if you think about time cards like doing Outlook and setting up your calendar, it makes it really easy to build a time card system. And so with the Federated API, we could get the data from all these services. We'd already built a unified calendar component to show, a manager, everyone that they directly manage, and everyone under their managers of managers were like, well, let's reuse that calendar for a time card system. And it went pretty quickly. So I think we build momentum. And that's how we basically have gotten to the point where, 4 to 5 developers can do a lot because we kind of picked our battles wisely as we went through this process. I'm hoping I answered all the questions.
That was that was a very good, well-rounded answer. I noticed in there you said that when you kind of ingest that contractor, you auto-populate them as a user in ShotGrid, and I also heard earlier you're now moving into Jira, so kind of all the
Yep.
production tools. I assume that they'll auto-populate in Jira and other things they're using too. That's pretty cool. So we've gotten a few questions about the that as we'd expect at some point AI was going to pop up here. So, and I think because you were just talking about these efficiencies of what you built. So I'll ask the 2 questions
I think
here
you dropped out.
are, am I
Sorry,
back?
I can't hear you.
I'm not sure if that's, we might need,
There you go. I hear
I'm
you.
still here. Yeah, you do hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
So these 2 go together. How are you using AI, if at all, on this federated API? And the other one is, does any of the system use AI? And if so, where, how and where? And maybe, to what extent does AI matter in your world with this?
I'm going to start the answer with none of it supports AI yet. But I think we have a vision to take our federated API and make it AI compliant. What I mean by AI compliant is I talked about CRUD, create, read, update, delete, and schema. I think we plan on adding another abstraction layer so that we can basically use whatever AI service is out there that's the best one of the day, and run chat operations or image generation images. So we have a project proposal to basically add OpenAI and a new request type, to our list of request types called chat. And the idea here is you tell it what service, what environment, what model you want to use. You define the prompt that you want to use. You define, the user. Is this as a production manager? Please, translate all of these issues into formal user stories, right? And then I want you to give me that data back as a JSON file. So that would be an example of maybe, me verbalizing what that query would look like. So we've kind of outlined, what we think our federated API framework would look like running a prompt to any service. We'll start with OpenAI, but we believe that it'll have multiple models for which to choose from. We're at the point of our thought process that we don't really want to give the AI direct access to running the federated API. We think that would get out of control. So our thought process is that we would use kind of a RAG approach where we do the data collection. As you can see, our federated API can do the data collection really, really easily. So there might be a place where we can basically daisy chain post commands in our batch operations to say, find data A, find data B, find data C, and then in post command E, take A, B, and C and D as data input and tell me what did it cost to have that meeting last week. So we think we're really well positioned to add AI to our framework. However, our thought process is that I don't think we're ready to say this is a magic 8 ball that we shake and say, how much did this cost? I think we want to start slow by basically, adding that just as a service like any of the other services, and then maybe do some more sophistication. I talked about some of the sophistication of our federated API, like, bouncing across services to get field responses, deep field responses. Well, why wouldn't you, try to say, here's, a pointer to the response from the service above or the query above. So we think that there'll probably be a point at which we might be able to build prompts that pull data from other services. However, I stress that we don't really, in our first iteration of it, we'd probably put all that power that I'm suggesting behind an interface that builds a prompt. So instead of somebody writing a prompt from scratch, we build a form that says, hey, help me do this thing. A good example is, that, let me actually show you. Actually, I'm going to bring my screen back up again here. So the first kind of our first prototype that we basically, want to do, a good example is that we would know this would work. And hopefully you guys are seeing my screen.
Yes, I think we are.
Okay, so this is the first one that we want to use as a prototype. See this release notes field? It takes a while to kind of summarize what you did that week. We think we'll probably, experiment by putting a button that says generate an executive summary of the release notes, and then we put it in there, and then we could adjust it and change it. But the idea here is that that button that said generate an executive summary would do all the work to build this release notes, then use it as, RAG data input, to a prompt and say, help me generate, an executive summary, and then put it in here and validate that's what you want to say before you send it out to stakeholders. So that might be one of our first usage cases, to experiment with a federated API that's, integrated with, a cron, an AI service.
Great. Saker's asked a few questions, so I think we should at least get to them. So
Hey,
here's kind of Saker. I know we have to ask at least one of these, depending how much time we have. We'll get to the others, but so very cool overall. How hard has it been to get buy-in to build this API and show the value of the endeavor? Is there an effort to consolidate all those services that might overlap with each other?
So we already are going through the process of consolidating services that overlap, but a lot of them don't overlap. They look like they overlap, but they don't. So for example, sometimes we have Jamf, and that gives us, interfacing with, Mac machines, whereas PDQ allows us to kind of consolidate, with Windows devices, short of us telling, all the creative people they have to use Macs or Windows. It doesn't always work that way. Again, I think the studio tends to, empower creativity and whatever those disciplines use, they opt to. We definitely are on the hunt of consolidating duplicated services. Like, for example, I mentioned UTrack and Jira, but really that's really a product of being in transition. We just want to go to Jira because it's a lot better than UTrack, and that's what they've been using for a long time. So we are definitely consolidating as we go. There was another part of the question, and I got ahead of myself. What was the first part? Sorry.
Oh, sure. So, get back to Saker's question. So, it was how hard's it been to get buy-in, and then the other part was the effort to consolidate. So, yeah, the first part, I'll just read it again. How hard has it been to get buy-in to build this API and show the value of the endeavor to do it?
So buy-in was easier than I thought, but it's also because most companies, iterate trying to do this, and they make mistakes. And so, sometimes they reach out to big companies like Deloitte, asking them to kind of magically solve their business, but they kind of don't really get too far, underneath the business to understand what's sitting underneath it. When I got to Leica, they'd already gone through a transformation with a company like Deloitte and found some successes, but not a lot of them. And so really, but they'd already committed to a lot of things, and they were already, committed to like these 3-year contracts to negotiate prices. So I got handed, a number of these services to choose from. There was a buy-in to kind of do, to pick up where some of those outside, vendors hadn't delivered. So it was easier to do that here than I've had at other places. They were really at the point, Leica, and they are now, where they really want to grow, right? We don't do too many movies. It takes us a long time to do the movies, and really we're at this point where we want to be able to do multiple movies concurrently. And so they realized that doing things in Excel and exchanging documents through Word documents or Excel documents and emails and SharePoint wasn't going to cut it. Having a global resource plan across multiple projects that ran multiple years had to mature. So really, before I was even hired, they were already committed to this transformation. I was just there to kind of codify what it means and how we were going to do it. In other projects that I've done, I've inherited, a lot of vision around what does that, business intelligence integration look like. but it didn't have the structure around deployment, around Azure services or Lambda services. It was kind of all homebrewed services, and so reimagining them for growth. And then in other places, when I was at Imagineering, and managing, the scope of a project, we were using ShotGrid to manage, the Star Wars land and all the show items that were, bought, built, and installed inside of that park. And, a lot of that was managed through Excel documents. And so by codifying what they were doing in an Excel document to a schema and then showing them, here's what's possible, I think people can understand it. So it definitely took a lot of slide decks, a lot of executive, presentations, and then also, being able to kind of have, a prototype time in the first few months, saying, here's what we want to provide and here's where it'll benefit. And showing them the art of what's possible in short iterative sprints is how I think we basically were able to build up, the trust around what we've built and the success we've had with it.
Great. So there's a few, I'm going to ask a few more technical questions. What made you, if this was part of your decision making on this project, or if you're aware, why you opted for Open API over other libraries, like, for example, GraphQL?
So what we found, so with GraphQL, we wanted to do GraphQL, but we didn't have enough of the resources. We also found that basically with GraphQL, most of the services, GraphQL works really well, I think, if you own the services and the databases internally, but most of these things were SaaS services. So, and they had really poor REST APIs. So the first thing was, okay, we could still go to GraphQL when we want to. And we may, but now we have, we automatically generate open API descriptions every time we deploy code for the Federated API. The thought process there was that we could use that through, some of our, forward thinking for chat, for Copilot, right? Since Copilot uses Open API by automatically generating the Open API descriptions, we would then be able to kind of provide it, descriptions to services that we don't own, to the chat language and how to get to that data. So that was why we adopted Open API. The GraphQL stuff is interesting, but the biggest problem is like in a lot of these services, you don't have a lot of flexibility to redescribe the field mappings. And so I think there's a point where we might consider using GraphQL, but the GraphQL part of it, we already kind of built on our Federated API. When I talk about service bouncing and field responses, and being able to not pull that data, we have kind of this, language that allows us to bounce across services to bring data, into, a human user. Like, let's say I'm querying for a list of users from ShotGrid and I need to know their rate. It's just a very simple like adjustment and mappings to the other service where their rate is stored. And we think that that pairs well with GraphQL. We also weren't sure about GraphQL. What we also identified is none of the services up until the last few months really even use GraphQL themselves. So for example, they weren't even using it themselves. The only ones that I know of in our library or suites of tools that are using it are Shopify. And we've kind of adopted, a GraphQL abstraction layer on top of the shop, our Federated Shop API interface, and then Fabric. And Fabric, we're still trying to make our way to understand Fabric and Microsoft and how it interfaces with. I think with Fabric and having GraphQL, we might be able to make it better to get to data inside of Dynamics 365. However, so that we don't have to use OData, but we still are kind of, it seems very experimental. So I think there's a place in future where we translate a lot of that to GraphQL, but I think in the end, the fact that we have an abstraction layer to REST is what you're going to need anyways to get to GraphQL anyhow.
Okay, great. Another more technical leaning question. Are you using any type caching like Redis or Memcached for the common longer running queries?
We have a caching model that basically allows us to do a Federated API command. And in some of those parameters, we can say this is some data that needs to be cached. And we can set the iteration around that cache. And what happens is that when that query goes in, it looks at our caching layer and says, you know, should I run this every night, every quarter, every hour, or whatnot? And so we have some cron automation around the federated API that caches that stuff. We played with Redis, but we found out that we really didn't need to. We just built this caching layer that allows us to kind of store some of that data cached. And so a lot of times we will, instead of running the query over and over again, we initiate the kind of the cache address inside of the federated API. And then the federated API does its magic to determine whether the cache that it's trying to pull is current or not. Now, the caveat to that is that when you start looking at these federated form frameworks that are filtering and slicing data, we'd be blue in the face caching data. And so really we try to streamline the field responses that we want. If we can reuse that cache across tools, we do. If we need that tool to open really, really quickly, then we build a dedicated cache for that tool. And we've been doing that quite successfully, but it only goes so far. It just depends what the data is and how frequent the data changes, whether caching works.
Great. Gonna ask a couple more. You've been awesome in doing the Q&A. We're probably starting to wear you down here at some point. But here's one from Jonathan Bouchard. Can your users benefit directly from this idea, or is it a future plan to build a UI around this API? There's a bit of commentary that I'll go ahead and read. Says, I'm always torn between providing technologies to ease development of technologies and providing immediate value for users. Think it takes a lot of courage to pause a bit, develop this important infrastructure, which ends up pausing or slowing down the user-facing issue solving for a bit until you're able to resolve more user issues faster. It also takes support from upper management. You talked a little bit about that, all the presentations, for example, you gave, which will see the money being spent, but maybe no immediate results.
So I think we have lots of different types of stakeholders that are hanging off of our framework. So we have business operations users who hang off the framework, and they just lean on us to build these tools, whether it be a contractor initialization form, a labor request form, whatever. That stuff they don't really, they're probably not terribly interested in what sits underneath the hood. But we also have partners in our technology department, in our core infrastructure team. And that core infrastructure team, we are trying to encourage them to kind of use the federated API. We'll see that, for example, they had to do a migration. They're working on migration to migrate from UTrack to Jira, right? We need to move the data. So why not use the federated API to move the data around? And so they end up being partners for us. And then we kind of extend the functionality of the federated API to kind of do things like, well, I need to pull an attachment out of UTrack and I need to upload it to Jira. So I need to have upload, request types. And so we partner as well internally in our technology department across our infrastructure teams to give them, tools that they can use so that they don't have to roll their own, integrations and access policies. And there's really a benefit to that. And the big benefit is that all of our service keys are secured inside of Azure as in the secret management system inside of Azure. And so now we don't, we have less and less and less of, service keys that are out in the wild. We can do service key rotations because there's a point of entry inside of our federated API where we can control that. So in some regards, there's a lot of initiative and benefit once the department, inner technology department stakeholders understand the benefits of using the federated API. They're like, great, you have logging, we don't have to build that. You have service key management, we don't have to build that. You have permissions, that's great. And so we like to be partners with them because you never know when we want to be able to integrate. I'll give you an example where the cross-section of that was needed. We were tasked to kind of tie, some tools together. And one of the big problem was we were using LDAP and we wanted to kind of move to Entra. And so that meant building some integration that allowed us to run CRUD operations to Entra so that we could pull data from, where we, document a source of truth for employees, i.e. UKG, or contractors, Dynamics, via Entra. And so that's a great opportunity for us to partner. And then what happens is because we're using Entra and we have access to the user table, now we have access to the group table, which is the email groups. Then magically that form that I showed you that says create release notes, now I can go to Entra to get the truth about how to email different groups, or better yet, maybe on top of those forms, which we do already, I can use Entra groups to manage access policies, to that application, and that's what we're starting to do. So we're basically ending up, I guess you can say things become a single source of truth, right? When we used to build like action menus inside of ShotGrid, we kind of treated ShotGrid as the source of truth, for the email groups, for all of it, and access policies. But when you have like 20 different services, that doesn't work, and you don't want people to have to go to ShotGrid to do it. So we, said, oh, we have Entra and we can have groups. Why don't we make our forms hang off of Entra groups? That's really cemented. That's rock solid. And we basically built our access policies around these apps off of that. I hope that helps.
Absolutely. And in fact, I think you kind of is a good segue into, I think we'll make this the last questions. It's going to be two different questions I'm going to combine. And again, you've already, I think, kind of segued into this. So, part one of this that leads into then our umbrella final question is another from Saker. What happens when a source goes down? And from Doug McMillan, okay, great. Tell us what has broken and what have you learned? And I think that's a good final
What we
one.
learned is staging up these services internally is not great because we make mistakes and they go down often, like ShotGrid. So we've been an on-premise ShotGrid house and we're quickly trying to move to a cloud instance. So the goal, in a lot of ways, and same with UTrack, right? Our UTrack instance is on-prem. A lot of our services are gravitating to cloud service because they have better uptime response times. So that's our, the studio wide is, saying it's better for us to use some of these cloud services because then we can scale and contract as we need to. And so one of the, objectives is kind of get into some of the cloud services so that if internet is down, everything's down, and it's not about whether one service is down or not. One of the other things we do is sometimes we evaluate some of these services and we encourage their stakeholders to kind of find better services. Some services are really sitting on top of archaic, infrastructure, and we encourage them to kind of find contemporary solutions. And so I'm not going to point out the ones that, we've moved from, but we have, given some advice to some of the stakeholders. Hey, I think you should look at something that's a bit more contemporary, and that helps, make the integration a lot smoother, makes the response time a lot better. Sometimes some things are just you can't move them. Like our payroll service isn't going to move out of UKG easily, and our ERP system isn't going to move away very easily. So we mitigate all those as best we can with committing to staging environments. We have some health commands that go through the Federated API that can go through all the services concurrently and check health. So we do that so that when there's an outage, we're notified a lot quicker. We started to use services like Datadog to help with service outages. I think we've largely been, in a fine enough place, right? Our data warehouse hydrates at night. If it fails, it retries. So there's not too much of an issue around the hydration of our data warehouse. And if our form doesn't open, if our form doesn't get the initial data that it needs to cache and build the form, it doesn't open. So we put some blockers in ways that help protect us. Also, in some instances, our cache protects us too. If there's big data that's cached, right, we can use the cache even when the service is out. So there's some mitigation solutions. But of course, if all the internet's out, we're out.
Wonderful. I think that's a great place to end up. Michael Romey, you've been terrific today. Really appreciate it. LAIKA's in good hands with you. This is a fascinating system.
I really appreciate being able to share some of the things we're doing. We think, from my experience and having seen this done at a lot of different studios, this is the first time I've seen something that is as cohesive across so many different services. And I think there's more to it to learn and understand around it. And I'm just excited to be able to share it.
Absolutely. And there's so much more to be done. That concludes our session today. I'm going to, okay, Fran has gone ahead and put up some upcoming events. I'll go ahead and read those off to you all. So, Tuesday, the 12th of August, we have Pipeline BOF Day at SIGGRAPH in Vancouver. Look forward to that. In mid-September, part 2 of this, integrating AI and ML into VFX, animation and game studio pipelines, and more production efficiency with federated APIs. I'm sure that all those messages will be going out so that everybody's aware of what's happening and with who. I know that there's going to be Greg Massey from Image Engine and Cinesite will be speaking in September. I look forward to that. And terrific. Great being here with you all. Michael, again, awesome talking with you. Thank you for your presentation. See you, everyone.